This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association. Clean water is everybody's business.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Construction Record. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have...
This is Barry LePatner in New York.
And Barry, last year we talked to you about supply chains. It was just not quite the beginning of the pandemic, but we were sort of seeing the effects of the pandemic, the early effects of the pandemic. And now we've had a whole year for construction to adapt. And you were giving a bunch of sort of points that they should adapt to if they want to survive. What's sort of the state of the union a year later for the construction industry?
Well, if we talk about what was the same a year ago, and we talk about what's different, we're talking about two different universes in some respects, and in other respects, some things just remain the same as they tend to do in the construction industry. So maybe it's best if I start by talking about what's the same.
Sure.
This is the same industry as a whole, but still mired in a 20th century mindset of inefficiency. And there remains the impacts of projects put on hold from a year ago, major shifts in markets that remain on indefinite suspension, such as the hotel or travel or entertainment industries. And there are impacts continuing from disruptions to the supply chain. There's still, as we can talk about a little further along the way, a shortfall of skilled labor throughout the industry. Coupled with that, we don't see any industry organization that has taken a leadership role in coming up with ideas on how to help the industry either mitigate the situation or make plans for the near or long term. And there needs to be some recognition in the industry that, from a standpoint of what's different, is twofold in nature, as I've come to describe it in many discussions with people in the industry. Of course, what's different today is that there's a palpable sense of relief of having come through an extraordinarily difficult year and a half, where the predominant feeling was one of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. A year ago, I don't think any firm principal I talked to could assure his organization there's going to be work in the next 6 or 18 months, or how they could efficiently operate with teams scattered outside the office, and whether they had the needed technology to even try to carry out their normal design and construction activities. So that's one aspect of differentiation. But even more important in terms of differences today is a very, very important factor. Today, we're about, and people are starting to see over the hill, we're about to have a United States poised to move forward with a major construction boom, one that's going to see over $35 trillion spent over the next 30 years. And this is in part because we have a pent-up demand from the pandemic, but it's mostly driven by the fact that, as the U.S. Census Bureau has described, the U.S. is going to be adding 70 million more residents by 2050, all of whom are going to need new housing, schools, roads, internet connections, etc. And add to this, finally, that our current building stock in the U.S., that more than half of it is 40 years old and crumbling. So those are the differentiations that people should be looking at today.
I'm going to jump ahead a little here because it sort of pertains to what you just said. I have a question: will we ever get back to normal, and should we? But it doesn't sound like normal was anything we should have ever aimed for in the first place, from what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, we have an industry that has a 20th century mindset in the midst of a nation that is trying to move forward on every level with new technology and new ways of doing things. And this is an industry, because of its leadership, because it has an older model of principals leading it, because there's little opportunity for new, small, dynamic firms to get larger and larger jobs, that we have held itself back by its own reluctance to use advanced technology, which is spurring innovations in every other field, Warren.
And the pandemic sort of forced innovation upon the industry in some ways. Like, for instance, I've talked to contractors who did have to go to remote work, which would have been unfathomable before the pandemic. So how do you think do you think that's going to continue, or do you think people just kind of go back to normal if they have the option to?
Well, you just touched on one of the things that is going to be the new normal. Right now, surveys are indicating that across the spectrum of industries, including the construction world, 30% of workers who worked from home during the pandemic because they were forced to are having second thoughts about either coming in to the office full-time or the work site full-time, we'll talk about that, or as to whether they should come in 1 day a week, 2 days a week. And employers are becoming aware that they're going to have to deal with that situation. So remote work, where people prove they could be productive, they could be inefficient, may have to be something that has to be factored in, which is going to require utilizing these new platforms that everybody went to, that new communication imperatives to deal with clients and to deal with government officials and the like. These are going to be all part of the new norm.
And you mentioned the worksite, so maybe we should address what that'll entail. I mean, obviously, some stuff has to be in person in the worksite, but how's that going to change? And in terms of safety, we've had all this PPE stuff. I'm assuming that's not really going to go away, even if we don't have a virus to contend with.
Well, let's start with that as the first and foremost. In my opinion, which is taken solely from the health professionals who are advising our nation, COVID restrictions may be removed, but I don't think totally they're going to be left abandoned, because we currently have more than 30% of Americans, which represents 60 million of us, who have yet to receive the vaccine. So any company that fails to recognize that a virus is going to be part of our health situation in the near-term future, or that virulent viruses will continue to reach our shores from overseas, is being naive or innocent, or just doesn't want to pay attention. We're going to have to follow the lead from the health officials. I think government officials around the city, around the state, around the country are all going to be inclined to pay attention to those things. And I think it's going to have some impact on project sites.
And you mentioned about how employers are going to have to deal with employees who want to work remotely, and construction has faced a skilled worker shortage for quite some time, regardless of the pandemic, and now it's even more so from the sounds of it. But that sort of skilled worker shortage seems to be spreading across almost all industries, or at least there's a more of a the employee has a little more power now than they used to, I guess. So how do you think that'll affect the construction industry in terms of people being able to pick and choose where they want to work?
Well, I think there's two factors to that, Warren. First of all, the biggest threat, in my opinion, to this industry's recovery in the short term is the skilled worker shortage. And I'll tell you what I'm looking at. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics released a report, and I think it was joined by the Associated Builders and Contractors, the ABC, which said that in 2021, construction companies need to hire 430,000 more workers than in 2020. And this is before we start to account for what the new administration's infrastructure plan is going to require by infusing over $1 trillion into the construction world over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's going to create millions of new construction jobs. So building a workforce to handle a nationwide construction effort is going to, by necessity, require planning for how to hire these people. 2, the recognition we're going to have to increase workers' average salary. And 3, dealing with the uncertainty that's going to impact project costs and how construction firms are going to be bidding and winning or losing future projects that come along.
And you mentioned production costs, and when you talked to Vince last year, we were talking about supply chain breakdowns. And has that been fixed, or are we facing even bigger problems now, given how restrictive everything was for a while?
Well, let's look back for 1 second.
Mhm.
Before the pandemic, we understood in the industry as much as 30% of all materials and equipment on an average project was coming from sources outside North American borders. And we all heard for years about globalization and how American manufacturers and producers were going overseas, because why pay $20 an hour, $30 an hour or more for American manufacturing workers when you could get a small fraction of that in Vietnam, in China, in countries all throughout the Southeast Asia and other places where they were willing to work for nominal amounts. So those prices that we were paying for, which were lower for goods that had to take time and had shipping costs on it, still were very attractive. But what did we see? We see that the supply chain was totally disrupted when countries shut down their businesses, when personnel at docks were either laid off or prevented from working. We saw global shipping slowed. There wasn't just one ship in the Suez Canal that did it.
Mm-hmm.
Even today, there are many ships with supplies for projects still anchored all across the globe, waiting for backlog personnel to unload them. We have a shortage of shipping containers, which has exacerbated the problems because the trade routes are involved with global trade and go back and forth. And when the disruption happens to shipping containers or to breaks in the supply chain because of personnel on docks, everything breaks down. So the Biden administration today is beginning a Buy American program, but they want to bring American manufacturers to come back and build their factories here in the United States. By definition, that's going to take several years before these issues result in a new U.S. supply chain to meet demand.
And I guess with the pandemic, we had prices rising for a bunch of crazy reasons. Like you said, there's shipping container shortages. People were ordering a lot more stuff to their homes that they'd never done before. So that and people were renovating their homes, which brought material prices up for a lot of lumber and other types of things. What were some other sort of macro level price rises that you saw because of the pandemic?
Well, different markets had different problems here. So we all know that about massive, triple-digit increases for lumber, which affected the housing industry.
Mm-hmm.
We had prices of copper, I think, which are currently up 18% for copper wire. We have iron and steel prices up 45%. I think steel is 36% up. And all of these were having their impact on projects that were moving forward. But now, layering over this, $1 trillion infrastructure program, which is the largest infusion of money into civil engineering and civil construction in decades, we're not going to see a slowdown in pricing. The pandemic's impact on the supply chain overseas and new demand here that products be made in America are going to put extra pressure on producers for the steel, the concrete, the copper, and everything else that's going to go into all of this infrastructure. So there's not going to be an immediate addressing of these rises in these costs for a while, but hopefully over the next short-term years, we're going to see these prices steady as demand increases and we get more producers coming into the process to meet that demand.
Okay, and you mentioned technology. What are some technologies the industry should have been adopting in the first place, and what's some stuff they have adopted that they should keep going with now that they've been forced to?
Well, let's go back to the fact that the industry is the slowest adopter of new advanced technology of any industry in the nation. If you look at a chart of how much is spent per employee by every other industry, somewhere crawling along the bottom of that bar chart or that graph is the construction and the design industry. And this has kept the industry back from really addressing major problems of inefficiency. Years ago, I wrote Broken Buildings, Busted Budgets, my book on the inefficiencies of the construction industry. And what I talked about there was the fact that owners pay, according to all sorts of surveys, $1 out of $2 on a construction project were wasted because of the inefficiencies of the process. And I could go into great detail of it, but the main point is it was the lack of anybody looking at how every other industry processes materials moving along until they're installed, processes that involve how to get workers in the right place, processes of organizing trades to be on time to deliver, and the fact that there was hardly any technology. So what we're seeing today is available as a host of new technologies, but little adoption across the spectrum of the design and construction industry. But that is going to change shortly, and I'll tell you one of the main reasons why. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a new type of leadership taking over the helms of major design and construction organizations. Where is it coming from? It's coming from below. There's going to be a new leadership of younger people who have trained since birth practically to utilize technology, who are looking around their organizations and seeing that their elders have resisted this, continue to take 2D paper out to the field to look at how they're going to construct. They're individuals who understand how technology across the spectrum of operations, from human resources to implementing BIM and Revit standards that use 4D, 5D, and 6D databases, to how we're going to operate machinery in the field that will simplify installations, such as robotics, exoskeletal tools, and even driverless trucks. We're going to have a new generation that's going to understand they can use Revit and BIM to assist in bidding and field operations that will speed up invoicing and document change orders in the field. But that new leadership is going to come probably before 2030, but it's going to be a breath of fresh air for this industry and for the nation as a whole to reduce the inordinate waste of tens and hundreds of billions of dollars a year on project sites in this country.
Okay, great. Barry, I think that's a very optimistic place to leave it off. So thank you very much for everything, for all your input.
My pleasure. Always happy to join you, Warren.
This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.